which is going to be taking a closer look at how research data management really works. This talk takes place as a part of the task force evaluation and reporting in NFDI, a group that is therefore concerned about how to assess the state of research data management. And we often have difficulty really empirically assessing this state of research data management, which is partly because RDM can be viewed through multiple lenses. So one lens is usually a technical one, which regards RDM as a technical problem, right? It's related to tools, infrastructures, workflows. And therefore, when you try to assess it, you look at, the number of registered PIDs, the number of data sets, and so on. Others regard research data management at its state sort of as a standards problem. How many standards exist? How far-reaching are they? Which disciplines do they cover? And so on and so forth. Yet a third perspective takes or ties the state of research data management to the policy versus motivation problem. So in essence, the delicate balance between the stick and the carrot, how many people are motivated, for example, by the open science ideal, and how many are just, pressured by funders and others to do certain things or leave them not to do. All of these things do not really tell us the state of research data management because, and I guess this is my way to transition to today's topic, in a way, RDM is fundamentally a translation problem. How the individual researcher translates their technical standards, motivation environment into their concrete research environment. And this translation, which mostly happens in each individual's heads, is uniquely reflected, for example, in research proposals, which is why the perspective that our dear colleagues from DFG are going to present to us today is rather unique and will give us an interesting new line of insight for assessing the state of RDM. I am really extremely happy to welcome Richard Heidler and Jan Rohden, who will present an empirical analysis which will differentiate across time and across different scientific disciplines, the way researchers describe how they actually handle research data management, based on what is probably the best data source that exists in Germany on a sort of funding application, because it is based on individual funding applications, which are, to my knowledge, a very representative sort of set of applications. So they're not extremely biased, at least by disciplines and other factors. And it's also just, a large body of data. So we are really looking forward to being introduced to this body of research data management related data. And I will leave the introduction to Richard and Jan themselves, handing the floor over to you and looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you, Bernhard. Hi, nice to see and meet you all. I'll start sharing my screen. So, yeah, I think that's okay. Everyone sees the screen? Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, thank you, Bernhard, for the opportunity to present our results in this circle, which is really, I think, a good audience for this kind of questions we address, and we address exactly some of the most of the questions you mentioned. We have a slight change in our title between policy and proposal. It was between policy and practice. This is the analysis we will present now is already publicly available with a preprint, and the preprint is also submitted to journal Quantitative Science Studies, and we got our reviews yesterday, and one of the reviewers said that we have to be more cautious in respect to the to the proposal rhetoric and to the real practice. This is a question which we know and which is important, and we can discuss it later on. But that's why we changed the title here slightly. But the results are the same. Yeah, and so we look at the proposal, and I mean, you can expect that things written in a proposal have also some consequences for reality later on. But we can discuss. There's some research about it. We can discuss it later on. My colleague Jan Rohden is also here. Yeah, maybe you want to say something.
Of course. Hi to everyone. I'm also glad to be here. My name is Jan Rohden. Many of you know me. I know many of you. And I think it's a great opportunity to talk about this topic. And I'm looking really forward to it. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, hi Jan. And there's a third colleague, Christoph Funk. He did the most complex stuff in the article, the machine learning stuff. He is not yet here, but I hope that he will join us later for the discussion. So if there are really technical questions in respect to the machine learning stuff, yeah, we can just discuss it. I'm from the information management group in the DFG. Jan is from the literature and information from the list group, and Christoph is also from the information management group. And it's a collaborative project between our two groups inside the DFG headquarters. So I'll start with the presentation. I'll introduce the research questions. I will explain what data we used and what methods we used. And then we will show some results, and I will start, and then Jan will continue. And then we have already kind of discussion from our perspective, and then we can have the discussion with the whole floor. Yes. So the interesting question for us as funding agency is, which role do we play in promoting open science and professional research data management practices? And we know that we have political drivers for the whole topic. We have the German federal government's data strategy, the European Science Cloud. We have the NFDI, which is partially also a program with a political background. And we have research funders which already started early to push into this direction. For example, the National Science Foundation, they made already 2011 data management plans mandatory. So some funding agencies were really early, and proposals then are a critical interface where these policy expectations are translated into anticipated research practice. So this is what applicants plan to do. And we looked at all applicants, we looked at rejected and at funded applicants. And if you look at the literature, it's interesting to see that there's a lot of research about the role of journals on open data practices, because they are at a point where they can pressure scientists to make a data availability statement. Some journals have mandatory open data practices, and the research says that this has an effect on the system. But in respect to funding agencies, there are some people argue, like Klebel, it's a double-edged sword, the role of funding agencies with respect to data sharing. On the one hand, they can provide leverage and mandate data management plans, and they can promote open science practices, raise awareness among applicants and reviewers. And in addition, they can also fund infrastructures like the DFG does, and the NFDI, for example, is an example. But there's also the argument that the scarcity and competition for grants could also incentivize researchers to treat data as a strategic resource, and which leads to protective behavior and minimal compliance. So put it in a nutshell, if the pressure is really high to publish, to do research, to get the next fund, maybe there's no time and no incentive to put some work and effort in the data sharing, and maybe funders even don't monitor what happens at the end of the project. And so that's not totally clear what roles funding agencies play here. The DFG used a more soft approach to this question. So we introduced a section in our proposal already in the year, I think 2010 it was introduced. It's a section 2.4 where applicants should address research data management questions. At the beginning, this was not mandatory, and it was not really enforced strongly by the German Research Foundation. This changed slightly, and now it's mandatory to write something and to write something substantial. But this is really only the last years. One approach of the DFG is to give guidance to researchers, and there we had the DFG guidelines in 2021 with the checklist, and there was a description of what should be in the section. I will explain it later in more detail. And so one question for us was the introduction of this guideline. Can we see an effect of this guideline on the way researchers handle their research data management plans in their proposal? And the third question is, how are there disciplinary differences in depth, profile, and specificity of research data management statements? So the aim of the study is to explore how research funding shapes scientific practice in open science, especially in respect to proposal writing, and if there is a cultural shift handling of research data on the level of individual proposals. And we also wanted to develop a tool which is a first step in monitoring the research data management practice and behavior of applicants. So that's the timeline. Okay, 2012 was the introduction of the section 2.4, handling of research data generated in a project. It's part of the template for the proposal in more or less all programs we have. Some specificities for complex coordinated programs. Then in 2015, there were first guidelines of handling research data, which suggested best practice. And then 2018, 2019, we had a lot of subject-specific statements where some bodies, Fachkollegien from the DFG, wrote their own concepts and their own recommendations how to handle research data in their project. And then in the year 2021, we had the introduction of the checklist. And the checklist contains 6 topics. This is important because this is also part of our analysis. The checklist specifies what the DFG understands by research data and formulates questions under the section. The first section, data description. So you should describe what kind of data do you have, the amount, how large it is, what kind of file type. Then the second is documentation and data quality. How do you document your data? How do you for example, also with metadata, how do you make sure the data quality is good? Third topic is the storage and technical archiving of the project. This is the part of the storage and archiving in the running project. So the internal storage and archiving. This is not already the long-term data exchange in a repository. This is how you do it in the running project, how the data is secured, how it is stored, how it is shared between the scientists. Then we have the fourth topic. This is legal obligations and conditions. which is on the one hand questions of licenses or data protection, but also questions of anonymization of the data in case of confidential or medical data, for example, and all stuff which concerns with ethical and legal conditions and obligations. The fifth topic is data exchange and long-term accessibility. So that's a question, how do you share your data later on? Or if you cannot share it with everyone, how do you make it accessible to others? How can you store it in a long-term way? And maybe also what kind of repository you can use for your data. And the sixth topic is responsibilities and resources, which means it takes time and work and resources to manage data professionally. And so what kind of responsibilities do you have? Who does it and with which resources? So here you can see the checklist. It's on the website. It's still the same from 2021. That's the English version. We have also a German version. So that's our research question part and some kind of background information on the research data management policy. Yeah, and now we looked at the individual grants program, at the Sachbeihilfe, as you know it. And we added a year for our presentation today. The preprint ends in the year 2024. We end in the year 2025, which is nice because we see some more dynamic and how the stuff developed in the last year, which is really nice. So you're the first to see the year 2025. And we have you chosen the individual grants program because it's the most, as Bernhard already explained, the most demand driven, the most open of our programs, and it's also kind of everyday research, the usual research which is really done every day, and where there are where there is not a focus on huge resources on data management. If you have, for example, a Sonderforschungsbereich, you can have some infrastructure, extra projects for this stuff. But the usual Sachbeihilfe has to do the research data management in the ongoing project. So that's we thought that's kind of program where we can learn how really at the ground work the landscape is changing. So we have 85,000 proposals, which we had to exclude some proposals, especially where the lead agency was not the German Research Foundation, and they didn't have to use the template of the German Research Foundation. And in these cases, you don't have the section, or it's called differently, or sometimes, yeah, it's missing. So we had to exclude these proposals, and yeah, a few proposals where we could extract full texts. So yeah, the analytical approach is first to extract the section, and which is already a lot of work and really took us a long time. We optimized this. Now we are really at a point where we can extract parts of proposal really much better. But as you know, the proposal is a template. It's uploaded to the ELAN system. It's a PDF file mostly, or a Word file. And we started in the year 2020 to build a text mining database internally in the German Research Foundation, which has also some kind of back files till the year 2017. So now we have the proposal as full text and we can analyze it. And this was one of our use cases for this new possibility. So we extracted the section as good as possible, the section 2.4. But you have to be in mind there are some variations, especially in the first years. There are variations where the section was just left out because there was nothing after 2.4. Then they just continued with 3. So some just leave it out. It maybe shouldn't happen, but it's not always the case that then they have to resubmit. So sometimes it's just, especially at the first years, it was just like that. And then you have other cases where they had the section, but they explicitly wrote a short sentence, it's not applicable for us. You can argue in some cases that research data management is not applicable. You can argue maybe in some cases of pure mathematics or maybe philosophy in some cases. So it's okay. So it was accepted, and then we found sometimes not applicable, sometimes just some sign or sometimes also a sentence with an explanation. You will see it later in the analysis, and that, or you, and the last variant is you have a kind of meaningful text. And yeah, I will show later on a little bit more about this. And one part of the analysis was that we tried to, in this text section, that's the section where they write about the data exchange and long-term archiving. And that's also where they should and could plan how they want to share their data later on, which means they should and could put it in a data repository. And so we used the RDM meta database, which is originally been founded by the DFG a long time ago, and which is a meta database with more than 4,000 entries, where all data repositories are can be downloaded, and we use the name, the internet address, the additional name, the alias name, but we had also some kind of corrections where, for example, when they had unambiguous, when they had ambiguous terms, we looked for case sensitivity. So we put a lot of work in really fetching these the mentioning of a repository. And we also checked it with some samples whether it worked. And yeah, I think at the end it worked good. And so we counted in the way then a repository mention means that a repository is mentioned at least once in one proposal. But some proposal mention also 2 or 3 repositories. That's okay. Maybe they use different repositories for different data types, or maybe they are still not decided whether to use this or that repository, or there's a repository which is more code sharing and a repository which is more data sharing. Okay, so and the last part is the machine learning part. This was also a little bit more complex. We had 500,000 sentences in these proposals. 31% of the text were in English, and we used this checklist topics, the 6 topics, to classify each sentences with one topic. And we had a 7th additional topic. This is publication of results, because we found out that especially in the first years, sometimes scientists only wrote, we plan to publish our results in a peer-reviewed journal. Yeah, or maybe in some cases we plan to publish our results in the peer-reviewed journals, and yeah, in the best case later on they also wrote, and we will attach the data or something like that. But just this variation, if it's just the pure variation, we want to publish our data in the peer-reviewed journal, this is not a data management plan, as you all can see. This is kind of something which is already expected, but they wrote it, and we wanted also to get this this topic. So we have 7 topics, and we classified. So I will show you a little bit more in the next slides. So we used this is the part Christoph Funk did. We use Spectre 2 as a base model, and which we downloaded from the Hugging Face library. And the important stuff is that we annotated 2,000 sentences by hand. I will show you now. So you see these 7 topics, 7 from the checklist, and 1 additional, which is publication of results, and an 8th topic, which is unclassified. So each sentence was classified in one of these 8 topics, and only 1. We try to stick with 1. This is sometimes difficult, but because sometimes in one sentence they address more than one of these topics. And to produce a ground truth for our machine learning model, we did it as I will tell you now. We used 2,000 sentences. We had 3 coders. This was Jan, Christoph, and me. And we coded all 2,000 sentences, all 3 with one of the 8 topics. And then we had, I don't have the numbers now by hand, but we had more or less more than 2/3 which have all 3 had the same topic, and we had, I think, 90% where 2 of us at least had the same topic. And in these cases, we decided the ground truth is the majority vote. And we had some 10% of cases where we had 3 different topics coded in our coding by hand. And then we discussed all of them in some long sessions, and we decided for the main goal of the sentence. So what is the sentence mainly about? And then we decided for this topic. So, and here you see the proportions of our training data set with the 2,000 sentences. And you see that there are some topics are more often classified and some are a little bit more seldom, but it's a nice distribution. And with the machine learning stuff, we trained our model with our ground truths, and we also did some complex stuff. So we trained with a part of the ground truth, then we did some kind of fine tuning of the parameters. So I hope Christoph comes later. So if you have questions about this stuff, you have to ask him later. The overall accuracy was rather high with 77.4%, I would say. Especially you have to take in mind that if you would code the sentence by hand, you had a chance of 1 to 8 to get the right topics, because we had 8 different topics. So 78% is rather good, and we have some topics which could be classified more easily, some which were a little bit more difficult, but overall it worked well. Yeah, and we did this whole work because we cannot classify for 500,000 sentences by hand or by ourselves, but we wanted to extend our analysis, which we wanted to go really into the content of the text. We wanted to extend it to all proposals, to all years, to all subject fields, and this was our work, our way to do it. So now we have some descriptive statistics at the beginning. By the way, I don't see the chat or anything, so if there are some urgent questions, please tell me. So this is the length of the section, and here you length counted by number of tokens, more or less number of words. And here you see that there is a steady growth from 2017 to 2023, and then with the introduction of the checklist, you see that there's a kind of steeper growth, and now it's more it's again a saturation with the year 2025. And you also see the percentile, so you see it's an uneven distribution. You have some longer text, and so there are some texts which are really long, but mostly are at 200 tokens at the moment. So this is already kind of first hint that the introduction of the checklist may be, at least, I don't want to talk about an effect, but at least there's a coincidence of introduction of checklist and the length of the papers. So we did an additional analysis. We looked at the content on the level of proposals, and you can now go to each proposal and you can look what type of proposal is it in respect to the completeness of the text. So we have these categories with no section on data handling, which I already told. For example, in the year 2017, 8% of proposals had no section on data handling. They just left it out. 10% had an explicitly missing, so they wrote not applicable or something like that. And then we have additional 8% where we found a sentence, but the sentence was categorized as unclassified by our machine learning model. So, or maybe publication of results, but none of the checklist topics. The checklist topics are the stuff we want to see. These are six different topics. I explained them. So you can see for 2007, if you make the addition, you have 26% which don't have kind of meaningful text, and the rest has kind of meaningful text, starting with 31% which only address one topic, maybe data sharing, we don't know. The 24% address two topics, and some address 3 or 4, and a minority, tiny minority addresses all 6 topics. And then when you look at the year 2001, you see a change in this topic completeness. So especially in the last year, you see 20% of proposals have addressed all 6 topics from the checklist. So, I mean, maybe there are some reasons to not address all topics from the checklist. Maybe there are now legal obligations or some stuff, but you can see that the texts have become more meaningful and more complete in respect to the checklist topics. And then we also differentiated it by Fachkollegium. We went on this really granular level because it's really interesting to see these differences. And you see, and you have to go on this granular level with the DFG subject classification scheme, which is really nice and good for these analysis, because you see difference on this low level. You see, for example, in philosophy, a lot of this is the complete period 2017 to 2025, and you see that half of the proposals for the complete period don't have a meaningful text in respect to one of the checklist topics, but we see also 28% write explicitly missing. So at least there's something written why they don't have data management plan. And you see some difference in the some low levels in the jurisprudence history, but also some rather complete data management text in psychology and the social science and humanities. And in the life science, the pattern is more similar. They all have really more or less complete text. In the natural science, also some variation, especially in mathematics. And we have less texts addressing the complete checklist. And in other fields like geophysics, we have high levels, or in water research, and in engineering overall also high level of completeness in respect to the topics of the checklist. This was one visualization about the development, the dynamics, and one about the fields, and this combines both. This is a more aggregated level. This is the Wissenschaftsbereiche of the German Research Foundation, and yeah, I have to speed up a little bit. I think this is the dynamics, which is the highest in the engineering science. So the number of topics addressed in the proposals. So since we looked at the at the topics and the content, we can also look at the how or which content has become more prominent. And there you see, for example, that the data documentation and the data description has grown, and also topics like which had been really small responsibilities and resources. So at the beginning, they didn't wrote anything about the responsibilities and resources, and now they write in some cases. And you can also see at the different subject fields in this case, and you can also find some interesting differences. For example, in the medicine, the legal obligations and conditions have a larger part because they have some data protection stuff. And also in the natural science, you can find different profiles in respect to which topic they addressed in their text. You will find later on these slides also in the preprint and then the later version. So now I'll give to Jan. He will say something about the proposal, the repository mentions.
Thank you a lot, and I'll dive right into it. You see here a slide that shows you the amount of proposals that deal and mention data sharing. And if you look at the slides carefully, you see maybe two main takeaways. On the one hand, I would like you to focus on the lower part, on the two gray areas and the bright red area. You see that the number of proposals that does not mention data exchange or repositories at all decreases from 2017 to 2025 from more than 50%, nearly 60%, to about 20%. So we can see that data sharing is increasingly mentioned and described in the proposals we took a look at. On the other hand, however, you also see the blue areas, and the top three blue areas describe proposals that mention at least one repository once in the course of their chapter on research data management. So the number of proposals that actually describes repositories increases over time on the other end as well, from 13% in 2017 to more than 40% in 2025. We see that with the increase of the description of data sharing, also the number of mentioned repository increases, which means that the community seems to be more and more aware that there are solutions like repositories for data sharing available that fit their purposes. Could we head to the next slide, please? What you all know, but what I have to emphasize every time I talk about research data management is that while research data management is of course a general topic that concerns all, the different disciplines deal with that topic very differently. Richard mentioned one example, and you can see that is also the case when it comes to data sharing. We see here these four big scientific disciplines, or at least two of them, from the DFG and the different subjects that are beneath it. And we see here also the same color pattern regarding data sharing. And if you, for example, take a discipline like philosophy, you see that more than 70% of the proposals do not mention repository and do not mention data sharing. If you take a look at another discipline of the same group, for example, at linguistics, the case is very different. Here, only about 20% have no mention of data sharing, and a lot more mention repositories. And I would like to emphasize that when we talk about data sharing, we have to keep in mind that there are different disciplines with different practices, different histories, also different availability of infrastructure. So we have to take a deep dive and look at the practice of each discipline. Next slide, please. That also goes for other disciplines. A good example are the natural sciences. Mathematics, you see here more than half of the proposals do not mention data sharing or repositories, while if you look at the top, the atmospheric sciences, a lot more proposals already mention data sharing and refer to repositories. So also in the group of the natural sciences, huge differences. And when we deal with research data management and infrastructure building, we have DFG have to take every every scientific group differently and act accordingly. Next slide, please. Now, considering the repositories that are mentioned in the proposals, if you take a closer look, you yield some interesting results. You see here a list of the top 50 repositories mentioned at least once in the proposals. We have provided you the name of the repository, the scientific disciplines, the country it is based in, the kind of institutional model it has, whether it's commercial or non-commercial, and the number of proposals that mention the repository at least once. And if you make it simple and only take the top 10 on the left side into account, you notice a few things. On the one hand, that there are many multidisciplinary repositories marked in gray, so the multidisciplinarity is very prominent in the proposals we analyzed. You also see a lot of red color, which refers to the life sciences. So among the repositories that are mentioned very often, life science repositories are very often in there. The number one repository is GitHub, which you may have encountered when sharing code, but it's also increasingly used for textual literature data, for example. And that is a repository that is based in the US and commercial. And when we consider what we do, that we actually fund as a DFG German research, we have to acknowledge that many of the repositories are internationally based. There are, of course, German repositories, but there are also some from the UK, some from Europe, and many from the United States. And in the list are also 3 very well-known commercial repositories: the number 1 GitHub, the number 24 Mendeley, and the number 15 Figshare. So commercial repositories play a role to some degree. Next slide, please. The element of multidisciplinarity is strong in all disciplines, and you can see here the cross table that on the x-axis describes the kind of repository and the kind of discipline the repository is assigned to. And on the y-axis, you can see the repository, the proposal, and the disciplines it belongs to. So if you take a look at the first example, humanities and social sciences, you see in the light blue area that there are 1,579 repositories, proposals that mention a repository of the same disciplines, but nearly twice the amount that refers to a multidisciplinary repository. And we have a lot of disciplines that actually refer more to multidisciplinary repositories compared to their own disciplinary repositories. One exception of the life sciences. Here you see the darkest blue color are the 8,088 life science repositories that are mentioned in the proposals, compared to multidisciplinary repositories, which only 7,937 proposals mention. In other words, multidisciplinarity is a thing for many of the disciplines. Next slide, please. And interesting is also the outlook if you look at the distribution of the repositories. So if you consider how often all the repositories are mentioned in the single proposals. Here you see something you may have encountered in other contexts, the Gini coefficient, which is today often described to talk about wealth and distribution of wealth in modern societies. You see the gray area in the center that would provide the position of an equal distribution. So in the case if all repositories mentioned were mentioned as often as each other. You see, however, that the distribution is not very equal. You see the red text that described that the bottom 50% of repositories were mentioned only 10 times, so that there is a concentration. And you see that the concentration increases in 2025, which means there is increasing trend that some repositories are mentioned very often in the proposals, which means that some repositories seem to be very well placed in different communities. Next slide, please. And we have included the slide because in the last 12 months there have been great talks and many reflections on the question of data resilience. How fair can data be if you, for example, have US involved structures involved or commercial structures involved? We also took a look at that, and you can see that US involvement since 2017 has decreased from about 57% to 41%, which, if you at least consider the current policies in the USA, is a good thing. However, on the other hand, the number of commercially involved repositories has more than doubled from 8% to 20%. And we're always in terms of the DFGs and talks what we should do with that info, what it means for the security and the availability of our data. Next slide, please. And that leads us to the conclusion. We have learned a lot from that analysis. On the first place, we have learned that the substance of RDM text is growing, which means that there are more detailed, longer passages on research data management with more topics from the checklist from the DFG taken into account. And we have also noticed that the number of repositories mentioned is increasing over the years, with fewer REST repositories and on the other hand, more commercial repositories. In other words, we believe that research data is more and more reflected in the proposal of the DFG, which seems to be a good thing. The second thing we've learned is that we have to be aware of disciplinary differences, which were a thing in 2017 and which are important till today. The disciplines have different traditions, different availability of infrastructure, and that reflects on how they describe research data, if they describe it in the proposals. That finding is also supported by literature, for example, by Rohden and Tessina. So when we talk about research data management, there is not one solution for all. We have to look at each discipline separately. We're happy, however, that the aim we had, that what we want to trigger is a reflection of research data management on scientifically sound research data management that seems to have worked, because there is the NFDI, all your work, of course, there is policy building, there is a DFG checklist maybe, but it appears that in the proposals, more and more applicants seem to give space, give room, give thought to research data management. And thus can be a sign for the fact that the interplay between policy making, application practice, and community norms is coming into play, is becoming clear. And we believe that is a fundamental point. As Klebel in the wonderful citation stated, in order to have a successful change in data sharing practices, that must be driven by a culture shift that goes beyond mere adaptive compliance. So good research data management is not following a set of regulations by DFG or writing a data management plan. It's about changing the way science and research work to make data management an integral part of research that is filled with life. That is our goal. That's why we work at DFG. That is what you all work for. And that's why I'm happy to be able to discuss that topic with you. That's all from me, from us. Thank you for your patience, and we're happy to discuss with you. I see the chat is very vivid, so it will be a nice discussion. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much.